Welcome to Chapter 3. I hope everyone enjoyed Chapter 1 and Chapter 2, the videos, the lectures. Make sure to print out your PowerPoints. Your information from your test will come from your PowerPoint and from the readings in the chapters. And by now you've probably seen that we do have a total of 3 tests. Each test will have 25 questions. You will have 48 hours to answer the 25 questions. And if you're reading your chapters and your assignments as you go through, you should be able to do fine on your test. So let's talk about interdependence and the gains from that for trade. We talked about in the first 2 chapters how important trade was and how it was a huge factor of economics and how much of a key role that it played in economics. In this chapter, we're going to talk about the meaning of absolute advantage and comparative advantage, how comparative advantage explains the gains from trade, how to apply the theory of comparative advantage to everyday life and to national policy. Remember, economists are always working with national policy, both on the government end and the independent end. Each person consumes goods and services produced by many people both in the United States and around the world. Independence and trade are desirable because they allow people to enjoy a greater quality of variety of goods and services. Imagine that if everything that you owned came from a garden or a farm that you raised, and all the clothes or anything else that you had came from products that you created, that you made. Which we know for the most part in this day and age that does not happen. For the most part, if we were to take a sticker of whatever country every product in our house was, let's say we had the flag of the country from where the product or service came from, and we go around sticking those flags on our washer and dryers, on our clothes, on our shoes, on our cars. Imagine the plethora of flags that we would have in multinational culture we would have inside our own home. There's probably more than 20 different countries where things come from in our homes, probably even more. There are 2 ways to compare the ability of 2 people to produce a good. The person that can produce a good with smaller quantity of inputs is said to have an absolute advantage in producing a good. So if it costs me less to make the product and get the product to the market, I'm said to have the absolute advantage. That's not always the best case, and that's not always the person that has the largest profit margin. The person that has the smaller opportunity cost of producing the good and getting it to market is said to have a comparative advantage. The gains from trade are based on comparative advantage, not absolute advantage. It may be the case that maybe it's costing me more to get that single product there, but I'm making more revenue from another revenue stream that is based off of that revenue stream. And so therefore my profit for my industry or my manufacturer is overall making more. Then that would mean that I have the comparative advantage. Like we talked about, trade does make everyone better off. It's not a win-win. Not everybody wins at the same amount that everybody else wins at. Some people do better than others. And that's what economists try to do. They try to use formulas and models to predict who is going to have the better comparative advantage. The principle of comparative advantage applies to countries as well as it does to people, of course. Economists use the principle of comparative advantage to advocate for free trade among countries. Comparative advantage is a huge deal when it comes to helping other countries see the value in trade. A lot of times we're not always open to trade, but economists use comparative advantage to be able to show the value of moving forward with trade. All right, so let's talk about the example. I believe it's either in the book or in your PowerPoint presentation. Let's say we have 2 goods, meat and potatoes, and 2 people. A cattle rancher named Rose and a potato farmer named Frank. Both of them like to consume their own, both potatoes and meats, but they also see the gains from trade and how that Frank and Rose should be working together. Of course, the gains from trade are obvious. Frank can only grow potatoes, Rose can only raise cattle. But let's say Frank could raise some cattle and still as well grow potatoes. And the same thing goes for Rose, that she could grow some potatoes along with raising cattle. So let's look at if we use these 2 to intermingle, to be able to work trade and see where we can find who would have, or how we would have the best comparative advantage. The gains from trade are not always equal, or like we talked about before, it's not always clear. We look at Rose and Frank, who, let's say both of them work an 8-hour day shift and use this time to grow potatoes and raise cattle. Okay, let's look at our graph that we have in our PowerPoint presentations and or either in our book. So we're looking to see how long it takes each person to raise or grow an ounce of meat or potatoes. It takes Frank 60 minutes to raise 1 ounce of meat. It takes Rose 20 minutes to raise 1 ounce of meat. It takes Frank 15 minutes to raise 1 ounce of potatoes. It takes Rose 10 minutes to raise 1 ounce of potatoes as well. So if you look at that just at first blush and looking at that, it looks like that Rose has the advantage. But as we break it down and we look at the production of possibilities frontiers, we can see that there will be a difference. So we take an 8-hour day. So if Frank is producing 1 ounce an hour in meat, which would mean he would produce 8 hours of meat in an 8-hour day. He would produce 32 ounces of potatoes in an 8-hour day. Rose would produce 24 ounces of meat in an 8-hour day, and she would produce 48 ounces of potatoes in an 8-hour day. So if we take the production possibility frontier and we draw it out for the example that's drawn in your book, the frontier possibilities are drawn linear instead of being bowed out. This is because it assumes that both Frank and Rose's technology for producing meat and potatoes allows them to switch between both. That the variables are staying constant, and they're able to produce one good or the other at a constant rate. As we saw in Chapter 2, the production possibilities frontier represents the principles of trade, trade-offs, and opportunity costs. We will assume that both Frank and Rose divide their time equally between raising cattle and growing potatoes. Frank produces and consumes at point A in your graph at 16 ounces of potatoes and 4 ounces of meat. Point B shows Rose producing and consuming at 24 ounces of potatoes and 12 ounces of meat. If we look at both of them specializing in trade, and we look at the possibilities of the frontiers, production possibility frontiers, and they come together and say, suppose they come and say, hey, we need to work together and trade together. Rose will spend a 6-hour day producing 18 ounces of meat and a 2-hour a week growing 12 ounces of potatoes. Frank will spend 8 hours a day growing 32 ounces of potatoes. Rose will trade 5 ounces of meat for 15 ounces of potatoes. So our end result with trade is Rose ends up producing 18 ounces of meat and trades off 5 ounces, leaving her 13 ounces of meat. She also grows 12 ounces of potato and receives 15 ounces in the trade, leaving her with 27 ounces of potatoes. Frank, on the other hand, Frank produces 32 ounces of potatoes and trades off 15 ounces, leaving him with 17. He also receives 5 ounces of meat in the trade from Rose. In both cases, they're able to consume quantities of potatoes and meat that after the trade that they would not have been able to assume or consume if they would not have invoked trade. Like we said in the very, very beginning, I don't want you to get caught up in the numbers. These are pretty simple. I hope you're able to follow along. I wish I could draw it out for you a little bit in class. We would normally draw it out and have you draw it out. So hopefully you're able to read along in your chapter and be able to read along with it and be able to understand the meaning. Basically, what I want you to understand is that comparative advantage helps each individual by using trade to be able to get more products and services to them or for them to get them to the market. So not so much the numbers, but more I want you to understand the concept.